Back to Open Line. I'm Chris Davis, sitting in the guest chair, and sitting in the guest host chair, I should say. And our guest chair is Dodd Galbreath with Lipscomb University. We were talking all things environment tonight, Dodd. And I want to pick up where we had kind of left the conversation before we got into a lot of our really interesting calls about when you talk about climate change skepticism. Yeah. From someone with your background, how do you kind of overcome some of those initial hesitations, that people may have about whether this is just a cycle and we're still on that part of the cycle?
Yeah, I think you just have to go into human mode. You have to realize the other person is probably scared about something. They're scared about their children's future. They're scared about their own future. They know that we have an economy that's heavily reliant on cheap fuel and abundant fuel, just like cheap food and abundant food. And so that brings up those kind of base fears. Most of the time, like when I used to work with farmers, I would just try to find something that was important to them, that was connected to the thing that I was trying to communicate. And for farmers, for example, if we're using less gasoline on the highways and all these individually owned automobiles and less diesel, their fuel costs are going to be cheaper while we make this transition. Diesel fuel is horribly expensive right now. I don't know how farmers make it, but with other folks, I think it's just when I go back and look at historical newspaper headlines and articles during the transition from wagons and horses to cars, a lot of those same fears and same comments are there. So it change is hard, and I think as long as we're patient with each other, and if I don't try to be, and I've been preachy, I've been self-righteous, I've made mistakes because I'm scared and I'm worried about my kids' future, but I've learned just to calm down, pray, and try to help someone see it from their perspective.
Absolutely. As a reporter here at News Channel 5, I'm on the front lines of a lot of these really big storm events that we've had over the last couple of years. You think about some of the devastating tornadoes, or the intense flooding in Waverly and all these type of things. Are these, maybe not entirely totally driven by climate change, but there's the conversation out there that is the changing climate making some of these storms worse. Are we seeing examples of that?
Oh yeah, easily. I mean, it's people often, the skeptics will quote back to dramatic ice ages and dramatic warm seasons where we had literally no ice on the planet, and that's all true, but what that represented was a planet that started off as a liquid rock and that took a long time to cool off from a secular science perspective. I work at a faith-based university where if God wanted to snap his fingers and look like it's 4.5 billion years old, I think he's smart enough to do that. But the science tells us, and the geologic record, you can go look at this in the Grand Canyon, you could see the layers upon layers that were melted and cooled on top of each other. Whether it was done fast or slow, it was a pretty amazing process. And in that process of that big hot third rock from the sun cooling down, we had this pendulum swing, this crazy oscillation of weather conditions until it got balanced out. And now the pendulum doesn't swing as erratically as it used to. At least it did before human carbon emissions started. It just kind of swung back and forth between a drought and a flood occasionally, or between a Category 5 hurricane just very occasionally, and more frequently other kind of hurricanes. But when you throw a chemical into the atmosphere, into gases that are the most miscible, most mixable, and the most chemically interactive of all the chemical equations out there, most of the chemical equations out there, you're going to get a fast response. And the weather is the response. The aggressive weather is the response. So it's just something that, as I heard one corporate CEO say one time, I'm going to have to put on my big human pants and get used to it, and deal with it. So.
Absolutely. Well, we have a few of our callers that have called in before that are wanting to chime in and be part of the conversation again. Let's bring Daryl back into the conversation. Daryl, go ahead.
Yes, sir. I highly respect that gentleman sitting next to you there. Sounds like he's got a lot of brains, believes in the Lord and all that.
Thank you.
California, as far as the electrical it's like we're trying to phase it in real fast, and they're having electrical problems anyways.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the United States in general, and as far as I understand, you were talking about tractor farmers. My question is, well, the first one is California. How do you see that working? At me, it's not looking too good as far as throwing farmers into EV tractors and all that. And my question is, where is the power coming from?
Yeah.
And I'm going to leave you alone there. Like I said, I highly respect you. You seem like a real nice gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate you, Daryl.
I appreciate that, Daryl, very much. That goes back to what we were saying about being human with each other, right? We're all just trying to get along and trying to figure it out. Before I heard that Komatsu environmental manager in Chattanooga speak, I was very skeptical about American agriculture getting a battery big enough to run a combine or run a tractor. If a mining truck can do it, I think we're going to see it in combines and tractors eventually. I just wish we would make it happen faster for passenger cars so farmers don't bear the pain of the transition. Because believe me, we're not making oil anymore. We're sucking it out of places that are the hardest places to get it out of in the most expensive way possible, and that's why we're seeing rates go up, partly because of that, but also because we have more people using it as well. But in California, I think you bring up a couple of good points. That's where a lot of our food is made. Unfortunately, it's also a drier, more arid part of the country. The bottom line about climate change is that we're blessed in Middle Tennessee. In the drier regions of the world, they're going to get drier. In the wetter regions of the world, they're going to get wetter. Remember that oscillation that I was talking about earlier? So anything that's already going on is going to get worse. Anything that's already kind of, the pendulum where it's swinging back and forth like it does in Middle Tennessee, where it's not as dry as California and not as wet as Indonesia, our wet storms are going to get wetter and our droughts are going to get drier. We've already experienced a drought, which is a pretty good example of that happening, and it's going to happen more frequently. So I think you're going to see a lot of migration, continued migration from dry areas and wet areas into areas that are more temperate. It's going to be unprecedented. I think there were somewhere between 5 and 15 million people that left, what was it? Not Iraq and not Iran, but what was it? Syria. That left Syria, that caused that big political upheaval in Europe and really caused a lot of political upheaval all over the world. That's small compared to the 60+ million people who live on coastlines and others who live in really hot and dry areas. So if we start grappling with this now, we're going to save ourselves a lot of pain. We're going to make places like California more livable. But as those fires that used to be natural and infrequent get more frequent and unnatural, it's just going to be difficult.
Absolutely. Let's bring in Sandra to the conversation. Sandra, go ahead. Welcome to Open Line.
Yes, I'm concerned about recycling of household waste, particularly packaging. Most of the items that we purchase are packaged. And I definitely believe in recycling because I personally do it. But I heard just recently that recycling plastic packaging and probably certain fabrics or items, man-made synthetic products, they're kind of difficult to recycle. That's what I've been hearing. I did hear that our country sent some of our recyclable waste to other countries, and someone told me lately that they have too much recycling waste themselves to handle, and they really are not too keen about accepting any other waste from this country. Is that true? I just need an answer to that question. And on the and concerning plastics, because most of the waste I recycle
Sandra, I'm going to go ahead and cut you there because we got your question in because we've got a few other callers, but go ahead.
Yeah, Sandra, it's a great question and a great point. What I used to tell my kids is bottom line, if you can't throw it in your backyard and not see any evidence of it, saying 3 to 6 months, it's probably not something we should be using. Unfortunately, plastic is really not recyclable. I was at a conference with, the Big Tennessee Environmental Show of the South down in Chattanooga a few months ago, where Tennessee Eastman said they had just figured out how to make one type of plastic infinitely recyclable, but it's too expensive to do right now. So what I mean by infinitely recyclable is, will it always be something healthy that you can use, or will it have to go to a landfill because the plastic petroleum-based molecules just wear out, and they just wear out. It's really not something that can be reused over and over again, like say wood back into organic material, or food compost into nutrients that we can put on our crops or something. But to go to your point about the American waste being rejected by other countries, that's true. Other countries around the world intentionally separate their waste to keep it from getting contaminated. For example, office paper is among the highest value waste that actually pays for a lot of other things to be recycled. Cardboard too. When a pizza puts oil on the pizza box, it'll ruin the entire recycling process for that batch of pulp that they're trying to convert that box into to be used for something else. So separating the streams doesn't happen that often here, and other countries like China have rejected those U.S. waste streams, and that's why we're not hearing as much about recycling in this country as we used to. I did want to add one thing, one word of hope. One reality of all these things we face is that there will be consequences, but they can be short-term consequences. And even with recycling, for example, we find out plastic is not recyclable and we shift to a different kind of packaging. But I often teach my students out of 2 different books in our earth science class. One is a book about how resilient the planet is, and one is a book about how societies have collapsed and where they've collapsed. And if you look at where societies have collapsed, they've most often collapsed in the extreme regions of the world that are either really dry or really wet, and they really can't come back fast because there's not enough elasticity in their local environment to spring back. In most of the world, we can spring back really fast. So all of these mistakes can be short term.
Always nice to have a word of hope. We've got to get in a word with some of our sponsors. You're watching Open Line. We'll be back after this.